Have you ever felt like the more you love someone, the smaller you become? Like every time you speak, you wonder if you're too much. Every time you laugh, you quiet it down. Every time you dream, you tuck it away, just to keep the peace, to stay loved. If you've ever found yourself asking, why do I feel insecure in my relationship? Or am I slowly losing myself just to belong? You're not alone. Many people stay in emotionally draining relationships, shrinking themselves bit by bit, mistaking survival for connection. But love was never meant to cost you your voice, your light, or your truth. According to Jung, the journey of individuation, of becoming your fullest, truest self, is not just personal growth. It's a return to wholeness. This video is not about blame. It's about reclaiming your power, rediscovering your self-worth, and learning to set boundaries that honor who you are. And if you've forgotten who that person is, this might be the beginning of remembering. You're not broken, you're awakening. Stay with me, because the day you started shrinking wasn't the day you lost love. It was the day love asked you to disappear, and that's where our story begins. She used to be radiant. Emily, a woman who once filled her world with colors and canvases, who spoke loudly when she believed in something, who laughed with her whole chest and dreamed without asking permission. She didn't just live, she glowed, until she fell in love. And little by little, she dimmed. Her partner didn't say much at first, just subtle remarks, sidelong glances, quiet disapproval. That's a bit much, isn't it? You're overreacting. Do you always have to be so intense? At first, she brushed it off. Then, she adjusted. She softened her voice. She second-guessed her excitement. She tucked her dreams behind her job, behind his needs. Not because she was weak, but because she thought that was what love required. This is where so many of us begin to disappear. Not all at once, but piece by piece. We start to apologize for our emotions, silence our opinions to avoid tension, and shrink our passions because they take up too much space. We begin to ask ourselves, am I too much? Or worse, maybe I don't deserve more. And slowly, we trade authenticity for acceptance. This pattern isn't rare. It's heartbreakingly common, especially in a culture where we're conditioned to hold on at all costs, to equate compromise with worth, and where emotional self-sacrifice is often romanticized. We call it maturity. We call it being a good partner. But if the cost of love is your self-worth, it's not love, it's submission. Jung, one of the most profound voices in modern psychology, saw this not as a flaw, but as a symptom of a deeper forgetting. He believed that every person holds within them a unique blueprint of wholeness, a true self waiting to be lived. He called the journey to uncover this self-individuation. But individuation cannot occur when we are hiding. You cannot grow into yourself if you're busy cutting parts away to fit someone else's mold. Jung never said love wasn't sacred. He believed love is what awakens the psyche. But he also warned, if a relationship pulls you away from your essence, it is blocking, not blessing, your becoming. And yet, we stay. We convince ourselves it's just a phase, or that if we're more agreeable, less sensitive, more desirable, things will improve. But love should not be a test you're constantly trying to pass. It should not be the reason you forget how to dream. So what do you do when you realize you've shrunk to survive? First, you stop blaming yourself. You're not broken. You adapted. You tried to belong. And that instinct to connect, to protect, was never wrong. But now it's time to come home to yourself. Start small. Name something you once loved but stopped doing. Paint again. Dance badly. Sing loudly. Write without deleting. Do something unedited. Each act is not just a memory of who you were, it's a seed of who you still are. And when you feel guilt or hesitation rise, ask gently, Who taught me that my joy was too loud? You might realize it was never about being too much. It was about being around people who were too uncomfortable with their dimming. Reclaiming your power isn't loud or violent. Sometimes it's as quiet as saying no when you used to say yes. As subtle as choosing solitude over company that drains you. As profound as remembering that your worth was never up for negotiation. Because you were never meant to shrink. You were meant to unfold, to take up space, to live in your full emotional range, not just the parts that make others comfortable. This realization opens a new path, one that may feel unfamiliar but deeply necessary. And it leads us to a deeper question. What if the very relationship you're holding on to is the one keeping you from becoming who you truly are? As we continue, we'll begin to see that love which leaves you questioning your worth may not be love at all, but a reflection of the wounds you've yet to tend. And perhaps the heaviness in your chest isn't just heartbreak, but the quiet voice of your soul asking to be set free. Not every ache means you're breaking. Sometimes it means you're waking. And once you've heard that quiet plea from your soul, something begins to shift. Suddenly, the discomfort you've been calling love starts to feel more like erosion. You notice it in the smallest moments. The hesitation before you speak, the shrinking before you share, the guilt that shadows your joy. It happens slowly until one day you realize you're walking through your relationship on tiptoe, careful not to disturb, cautious not to disappoint. But love, in its truest form, was never meant to feel like walking on glass. There's a quiet violence in the way we teach ourselves to apologize for simply being. You say sorry for crying, sorry for needing, sorry for having boundaries. You soften your truth to keep the peace, thinking that if you just make yourself easier to love, the cracks will disappear. But the more you bend, the more you vanish. You start wondering if you're the problem. If your dreams are unrealistic, if your emotions are too much, if your voice is too loud, your needs too complicated, your presence too inconvenient. And that constant questioning, that's not self-reflection, it's self-erasure. It's insecurity born from a space that doesn't feel safe enough for your full self to exist. Carl Jung once said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Yet we often enter relationships thinking we must become acceptable first, more agreeable, more polished, less messy. We believe that if we can just manage our imperfections well enough, love will stay. But Jung taught us that wholeness, not perfection, is the goal. Love isn't about filtering yourself to avoid rejection. It's about being seen in your entirety and still held. When a relationship demands you leave pieces of yourself behind, it's not asking for love. It's asking for sacrifice. And not the kind that deepens intimacy, but the kind that empties your identity. In today's world, the pressure to stay in a relationship, especially one that looks good from the outside, can be crushing. Social expectations tell you not to give up. Religious dogmas tell you to endure. Fear tells you that maybe this is all you deserve, but what no one tells you is that staying in a space that constantly feeds your self-doubt is not noble. It's neglect. You deserve to feel secure, not scrutinized. You deserve to grow, not shrink. You deserve to be loved without having to disappear. So how do you begin to reclaim your power when you've forgotten what it feels like to be whole? Start by noticing the moments when you question your worth. Track the times you filter yourself, not for clarity, but for approval. Then gently ask, what part of me am I silencing, and why? Awareness is the first step towards self-restoration, and in that space of quiet noticing, a new possibility opens, the permission to return to yourself. If you've stayed this far, I want you to know your presence here is an act of courage. Choosing to reflect, to feel, to ask hard questions. It matters. You are not alone in this. So many carry the same ache, the same confusion, the same longing to feel seen without shrinking. And together, through these moments of honesty, we remember something essential. You are never too much. You are simply in a space that asked you to be less. This understanding doesn't erase the pain, but it gives it meaning. It becomes a compass. And from here, we begin to walk differently, not to please, but to return. The journey ahead will ask more of you. It will ask you to unlearn what made you disappear. It will ask you to rebuild your relationship with your voice, your instincts, your worth. But every step will bring you closer to the person you were always meant to be. And that brings us to something deeper still, the part of you that was never lost, just hidden under layers of compromise. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore what Carl Jung called individuation, and why shrinking for love keeps you from becoming who you truly are. Because you were not born to fold, you were born to unfold. There comes a moment, quiet but unmistakable, when you realize you've spent so long trying to be loved that you no longer remember how to be yourself. After years of apologizing for your feelings, filtering your truth, and bending your light to fit someone else's comfort, you begin to feel like a stranger in your own life. And it's in that hollow space where self-worth once lived that a deeper question emerges. Not, how do I fix this relationship, but where did I go? This is not just heartbreak. This is identity loss. And it is here, in this fragile pause between confusion and awakening, that Carl Jung's voice rises through the noise. Not as theory, but as invitation. Jung believed that the deepest purpose of our lives is not to please, to perfect, or to perform. It is to become, to embark on what he called individuation, the process of becoming the person you are inherently meant to be. This isn't self-improvement in the modern sense. It's not about becoming more attractive, more agreeable, more successful. It's about peeling back the layers you've acquired from fear, expectation, and survival until what remains is true and whole and uniquely yours. But individuation cannot happen in a space that asks you to leave parts of yourself behind. You cannot become yourself while erasing yourself for someone else's approval. In emotionally draining relationships, self-doubt becomes a daily ritual. You start to believe that discomfort is normal, that walking on eggshells is just a part of love, that losing your dreams, your joy, your voice is the price you pay not to be left behind. This is not love. It's a slow and quiet undoing of who you are, and yet many stay, not out of weakness, but out of the false belief that compromise is noble, even when what they're compromising is their essence. Jung saw this dynamic. He wrote of the persona, the mask we wear to be accepted by others. In relationships that lack emotional safety, the persona becomes permanent. You stop taking it off. You stop showing up as you. Over time, your real self is no longer just hidden. It's forgotten. This is what Jung warned us against, the danger of over-identifying with the mask and losing contact with the soul beneath. He didn't ask us to destroy the persona. He asked us to go beyond it, to choose wholeness over harmony, to risk discomfort in pursuit of authenticity, because you were never meant to be someone else's reflection. You were meant to be your unfolding truth. Think of Maya, a listener who wrote to me recently. For years, she stayed in a relationship that looked perfect on the outside. Stable, respectful, long-term. But inside, she felt increasingly invisible. Her ideas were met with silence. Her emotions were called dramatic. Her dreams were labeled unrealistic. And slowly, she began to question herself. Her partner never raised his voice, never said anything cruel. But the lack of celebration, of genuine connection, of soul-level intimacy, eroded her. One day, she caught herself staring into the mirror, whispering, "I don't know who I am anymore." That moment broke her open. And from that fracture, something sacred began, her return to herself. Maya's story isn't unique. It's a reflection of what so many endure in silence, especially in a culture that prioritizes keeping the peace over telling the truth, especially when we're taught to stay small to stay loved. But what if you no longer needed to shrink? What if the pain you feel is not a sign that you're broken, but that you're being called back to life? This realization opens a new path, one that begins not with fixing others, but with remembering yourself. Start by writing down who you were before the shrinking began. What made you come alive? What did you love that no longer fits in your current life? These are not just hobbies or traits. They are breadcrumbs back to your essence. Reconnecting with them is not indulgent. It's sacred. If you're here, still listening, holding space for your reflection, I want you to know how deeply that matters. You're doing something powerful by simply staying with this discomfort instead of numbing it. You're beginning the work that so many avoid, the work of coming home. In the next part of this journey, we'll explore what happens when you stop hiding and start asking the harder questions. Am I playing small to be accepted? Am I performing safety instead of living truth? Because shrinking to fit is not belonging, it's forgetting. And it's time you remembered what it feels like to be whole. To remember who you are is a quiet kind of rebellion, and often a lonely one. Especially after years of performing safety, of wearing a version of yourself that others found easier to love. When you've spent so long shaping your voice to match someone else's comfort, the act of speaking from your truth can feel like betrayal. But what if the real betrayal was how long you stayed silent? Many of us shrink not because we're weak, but because we were taught that to belong, we must bend. To keep love, we must negotiate who we are. And so we begin the slow practice of folding, laughing a little less, dreaming a little quieter, softening our edges, doubting our instincts. We call it maturity. We call it compromise. But beneath the surface, something inside us begins to fade, until one day we realize that the version of ourselves we've been offering is not the whole story. It's a character carefully written to survive approval. The fear beneath it all is raw and ancient. What if I show up as my full self and they leave? This is why so many stay small. Why we tuck our gifts into silence, why we second-guess our joy, why we choose relationships that reward our compliance but never our wholeness. Yet Carl Jung reminds us that belonging, true belonging, is not found in becoming who others want us to be. It's found in the deep integration of who we already are. He saw the self not as something to be perfected, but as something to be remembered. In his words, individuation is not about rising above who you are. It's about becoming undivided within. But in relationships where you must shrink to stay, you're divided daily. There's the person you show them, and the person who aches quietly beneath. Over time, that gap becomes a wound. You start to lose the thread of your becoming. The relationship might survive, but your self-trust begins to erode. You start questioning your emotions, your boundaries, your instincts. You become a version of yourself that fits, but only because you've carved out everything that didn't. I once worked with a woman named Jordan. She was vibrant, unapologetically curious, and deeply intuitive. But in her relationship, she learned to mute those parts. Her partner called her too intense when she got excited about new ideas, too emotional when she cried at sunsets or songs. Over time, she adjusted, until one day, she couldn't answer a simple question without hesitation. "What do you want?" Her answer wasn't, "I don't know." It was silent, because in order to stay, she had stopped asking. That moment of silence, of not knowing your Oisaya, is not failure. It's a signal, a quiet alarm from the part of you that refuses to vanish completely. The good news is that part of you is still there. It may be buried beneath years of insecurity and people-pleasing, but it has not died. It is waiting, And the act of reclaiming it begins not with dramatic declarations, but with simple honesty. Honesty about what hurts, what feels small, what no longer fits. So if you find yourself wondering, why do I feel insecure in my relationship? Pause. That question is not a weakness. It's wisdom. It means you've started to notice the dissonance between who you are and who you've had to become. And from that noticing, something sacred begins. The return. You don't need to become louder overnight. You don't need to break everything down to rebuild. You only need to stop pretending. Start by naming one truth you've been hiding to stay loved. Speak it, not to be right, but to be real. That small act is not a threat to love. It's the soil in which real love can finally grow. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to acknowledge something. Your courage is not measured by how long you've endured. It's measured by how gently you choose to come back, reclaiming your voice, your worth, your aliveness. It's not easy work, but it is holy work. You're not too much. You're not hard to love. You're simply not meant to live folded into someone else's story. And this brings us to the next doorway. What happens when your light, your creativity, your passion, your authenticity starts to make others uncomfortable? Should you dim it or let it blaze anyway? Because perhaps the people who flinch at your brightness are not your mirror, but your misdirection. Perhaps the most painful part of shrinking is not the silence itself, but the moment you realize your silence was never necessary, that all this time you weren't too much. You were simply surrounded by people who weren't ready to witness your light. When you've spent years dimming down just to make others comfortable, rediscovering your full brightness can feel unfamiliar, even dangerous. But it's not your light that was the problem. It's the shadows in others that couldn't hold it. Marcus knew that feeling too well. A gifted songwriter with a soul stitched in melody, he found meaning in the quiet corners of music, lyrics that said what he couldn't speak, chords that held emotions words failed to name. His partner didn't share that language. She valued logic, structure, and predictability. And slowly, her words, though never cruel, began to cut deep. You always live in your head. That's not a real career. You should focus on something practical. At first, he defended his dreams. Then he justified. Then he stopped. The guitar stayed in the case. The journals gathered dust. He called it growing up. But what grew was the distance between him and the man he used to be. It's a story that echoes quietly through so many lives. You abandon parts of yourself, not in a single moment, but in the slow erosion of maybe I shouldn't. Maybe I'm too emotional, too creative, too spontaneous, too intuitive. And in trying to be just enough, you become unrecognizable to yourself. This is not maturity. This is a loss. And Carl Jung would call it a detour from the true path of becoming. In Jungian thought, every person carries within them a deep well of potential, the self. Not the surface persona we present to the world, but the expansive, creative, unfiltered essence beneath. The journey of individuation is about reclaiming this self, even when the world prefers your mask. Jung never suggested that growth is easy. He warned that becoming yourself might require walking away from those who only loved your silence. So why do we stay in spaces that stifle our light? Because somewhere along the way, we learned that belonging required dimming, that being loved was conditional, that we must trade our truth for approval. It's a belief system born from fear, fear of rejection, fear of being alone, fear of not being enough. But real love doesn't require you to go dim. Real love stands in your brilliance and says, shine. If this resonates with you, you're not alone. You might be someone who once painted, but now apologizes for wanting color. You might have loved dancing, but now feel foolish moving freely. You might have spoken boldly once, but now you second-guess every word. If that's you, I want to remind you, your passion, your creativity, your expression, they weren't distractions. They were doorways to your truth, and the people who are meant for you will never ask you to close them. So where do you begin when you've lost touch with your spark? Start with the smallest act of rebellion. Pick up the guitar again. Open the journal. Sing in the car. Sketch on the back of a receipt. Not because it leads to achievement, but because it reconnects you to a part of yourself that still longs to live. This is what it means to reclaim your self-worth, not through external validation, but through the quiet courage of being unapologetically you. You've made it this far through this journey, and that means something. You've stayed present with hard truths. You've allowed yourself to feel what's been buried. That alone is powerful. The journey toward reclaiming your light isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to the person you were before the world told you to be small. And as you return, a new question arises. Not, will they still love me? But, will I still choose myself, even if they don't? That shift in perspective doesn't just liberate you, it transforms everything. Because once you realize your light isn't too much, you stop asking people to dim it, and you start asking whether they're ready to see you fully. From here, the path opens wider. Because the pain you once felt in being too much was never your flaw. It was your invitation. In the next part of our journey, we'll explore what it means to be called too much, and why, in truth, you were never too big. You were simply never meant to be small. Not every space that cannot hold you is a sign that you are too much. Sometimes it's simply too small. After all the years you've been told to quiet down, to toughen up, to stop dreaming, to be more realistic, it's easy to internalize the message that your fullness is a flaw. But what if the problem was never your depth, your emotions, your fire, but the container that couldn't hold them? What if the love you lost didn't leave because you were too big, but because they never intended to stay in the presence of something so alive? You're too sensitive. You overthink everything. You dream too much. Maybe you've heard those lines your whole life, from partners, from parents, from friends. At some point, they stopped sounding like opinions and started feeling like facts. So you adjusted. You stopped sharing what moved you. You held back your instincts. You folded your enthusiasm into caution. But each time you shrank to make others feel less confronted. You chipped away at something sacred, your truth. Carl Jung believed that the process of becoming whole, individuation, requires integrating all parts of the self, even the ones that make others uncomfortable. The self, in his view, is not a sanitized, diluted version of you. It is the wild, honest, intuitive force that exists beneath the expectations. Jung never spoke of too muchness as a flaw. He saw the repression of our inner world as one of the great causes of inner suffering. The goal is not to shrink our complexity, but to hold it with reverence. But we live in a world that prefers neatness, that labels intensity as instability, passion as excess, and emotion as weakness. In romantic relationships especially, people often feel pressure to dilute themselves to seem lovable, to laugh less loudly, feel less deeply, want less boldly. And because we long to belong, we comply. We trade authenticity for acceptance. Yet over time, the cost becomes unbearable. You begin to feel invisible in rooms you fought so hard to stay in. And one day you ask, if I'm not being myself here, who exactly is being loved? That question changes everything. Because the answer is often painful. You realize that the version of you receiving love isn't fully you. It's a curated, edited self, a quieter self. And no matter how much affection you receive in that form, it never quite fills you. Because true belonging doesn't come from being chosen. It comes from being seen, fully, unapologetically, and still met with openness. If you're someone who's ever dimmed your light just to stay, I want you to know this. You were not born to be manageable. You were born to be real. Your sensitivity is not weakness, it's depth. Your dreams are not childish, they're portals to your purpose. Your intuition is not irrational, it's your compass. Everything you've been told is too much, may be the clearest proof that you are still alive to yourself. So, what now? If you've spent years apologizing for who you are, how do you begin again? Not with loud declarations, but with quiet reclamations. Start by noticing the moments when you censor yourself, not to protect others, but to betray less of you. Start by saying no when something inside you screams yes, or yes when the world says no, but your soul says go. Reclaiming your self-worth isn't about fighting harder, it's about remembering softer. It's about choosing each day not to abandon yourself, even if others still might. And if you're here, still listening, still feeling, still showing up, that matters. Your presence in this journey tells me you're already further than you think. Healing from relationship self-doubt and emotional shrinking takes time. It takes kindness. It takes space. But most of all, it takes permission. Permission to be as you are, even before anyone else understands why that matters. You are not born to shrink yourself to fit into places that can't hold your greatness. You are born to expand, to outgrow what's too small, to stretch into spaces that welcome your voice, your energy, your becoming. And the right people, they won't flinch when you expand. They'll breathe easier, because finally, they'll get to meet the whole of you. As we step forward, we'll take one final look at the cost of staying too small, what it means to keep shrinking just to keep love. Because sometimes, what we risk losing by leaving is far less than what we lose by staying. When you spend enough time dimming your light to keep someone near, you start to forget there was ever a fire at all. The ache becomes normal, the silence familiar. What once felt like a compromise slowly hardens into a way of life, where every part of you that used to sing is now carefully folded into quiet compliance. But love should never cost you your sense of self. And if staying means slowly disappearing, then the question is no longer, will they still love me? But rather, what will I lose if I keep abandoning myself to be loved? Many people stay because the fear of losing someone feels heavier than the weight of losing themselves. But over time, that cost adds up. You begin to lose direction, not because you don't have one, but because you no longer trust the voice that used to guide you. You stop pursuing your passions, not because they stopped mattering, but because you've learned to call them impractical. You feel disconnected from your own soul, not because it left you, but because you stopped listening. This erosion doesn't happen overnight. It's subtle. It shows up in the little ways you silence yourself, in the way you hesitate to speak your truth, in the way you say, "I'm fine," when something inside you is breaking. Carl Jung believed that the greatest tragedy is not darkness, but unconsciousness. To live asleep to your own truth, to betray your inner world so habitually that you no longer remember there is something worth returning to. In his view, the self, the full, integrated version of you, is not something you become by accident. It's a sacred process of remembering, of recovering, of reclaiming. But none of that can happen if your environment keeps punishing your authenticity. If every attempt to grow is met with resistance or ridicule, if your individuality is treated like a threat, not a gift. So why do we stay even when we know we're shrinking? Because we tell ourselves it's safer to be loved for half of who we are than risk being alone with the whole. Because society rewards us for being agreeable, palatable, digestible. Because we confuse survival with connection. But connection that costs you your core is not connection, it's captivity. And it comes at the expense of your future self, the one who still longs to write, to dance, to build, to speak without trembling. If this feels painfully familiar, I want to speak to the part of you that already knows the truth. You're not broken, you're awakening. That tightness in your chest isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the part of you that remembers who you used to be before you made yourself smaller to be kept. And the only way forward is not to burn everything down in anger, but to rise gently in remembrance, to begin again, not with permission from others, but with permission from yourself. So what does that look like? It starts with one small act of return. Maybe you open a blank page and write the words you were afraid to say. Maybe you walk into a dance class even though your body feels unfamiliar. Maybe you sit quietly and ask yourself, without judgment, what have I been hiding just to feel loved? The answer won't be easy, but it will be honest. And that's where your power lives. Because the opposite of shrinking is not shouting. It's simply allowing yourself to exist, fully, visibly, unedited. If you've made it this far, it means something. It means you're not willing to keep disappearing quietly. It means your relationship self-doubt has begun to lose its grip. It means your self-worth is growing louder than your fear. And for that, I want to acknowledge your strength. Not the strength to stay silent, but the strength to start listening to the voice within you again. So I ask you now, from the quietest and most courageous place in your heart, are you willing to lose yourself just to not lose someone else? Because if the answer is no, then your next step is not revolution, it's restoration. Speak again, paint again, dream again, not to prove anything, but to remember that you are still here and you are still whole. This choice to return to yourself is not the end of love. It's the beginning of real love, the kind that holds you without conditions, without edits, without shrinkage. And that's where we close this chapter. But the journey doesn't end here, because the person who makes you feel like you have to be less is not your person. Real love helps you grow louder, brighter, fuller, and maybe, just maybe, that love begins with you. Healing does not always arrive as a grand epiphany. It often begins as a quiet choice to stop abandoning yourself. After everything you've unlearned, after all the pieces of yourself you've retrieved, perhaps the bravest act now is to stand tall in your own skin and whisper, "I will not shrink again." Carl Jung reminded us that becoming whole is not a path of perfection, but of truth, and truth does not require permission to exist. So if someone only loved the version of you that was smaller, quieter, easier to carry, they were never loving all of you. And that is not your failure, that is their limit. You're not too much, you're simply no longer willing to be less. So today, begin again. Not by becoming someone new, but by coming home to someone forgotten. Yourself. The one who dreamed freely, spoke boldly, loved fully. They're still here, waiting. And finally, you're ready to open the door.